All right, let's talk cellular respiration. So we need to understand this is the opposite of photosynthesis, where instead of using carbon dioxide and water to build glucose and oxygen, now we're using glucose and oxygen to produce carbon dioxide and water. And in the process, just as energy was needed to build the glucose for photosynthesis, when you break down the glucose here, energy will be released. It's the opposite process. So let's skip ahead to here, respiration overview. Glucose plus oxygen, rather one glucose molecule plus 6 oxygen molecules makes 6 carbon dioxide, 6 waters, and the energy that's released is carried by the ATP molecule, which is the molecule that carries energy. Glycolysis, or back up a sec. Respiration is a multi-step process. This is the overall equation, but many things need to happen for this reaction to occur. So when you do respiration, you're breaking down glucose to get energy. And no matter what happens, when you first want to break down that glucose, it has to go through a process called glycolysis in the cytoplasm, which is outside the nucleus. It's inside the cell, but it's outside the nucleus of the cell. So it's in the cell, but outside the nucleus. Okay. And glycolysis is breaking down the glucose. When oxygen is present, it does it through, it is followed by oxidative respiration. So glycolysis happens under all circumstances. But when oxygen is present, after glycolysis starts breaking down the glucose, you'll have oxidative respiration. This is also known as, aka, cellular respiration. Cellular respiration only occurs when oxygen is present. Without oxygen, instead of cellular respiration, aka oxidative fermentation or respiration, you get fermentation. And fermentation happens when no oxygen is present. It can only happen without oxygen. It produces a lot less ATP than this does. Notice the difference in location. Mitochondria does the oxidative respiration, aka cellular respiration, and the cytoplasm, that area of the cell that's outside the nucleus, but it's just the cell, is the location of where fermentation happens. So, glycolysis is the first thing that happens to sugar that enters the cell. It breaks it down into, takes a 6 carbon molecule, breaks it to 2 3 carbon molecules that are called pyruvate. Again, this happens in the cytoplasm, which is outside the nucleus, but inside the cell. So glycolysis breaks down sugar to pyruvate, in the process producing 2 ATPs, and then taking NAD and turning it into NADH. This is an electron carrier. Okay, there's the same thing visualized a different way. 6 carbon glucose is broken down into 2 3 carbon pyruvate molecules, in the process producing some ATP, and NADH is produced. This is an electron carrier. This powers some of the further steps later on. So 2 ATPs needed to start, 4 ATPs produced, therefore net production of 2 ATPs, and that's fine. 2 ATPs net production. Pyruvate is then what goes to either fermentation if no oxygen is present, or oxidative respiration, aka cellular respiration, if oxygen is present. So what this diagram is once again showing, glucose goes through glycolysis to pyruvate. This will either go to this process if oxygen is present, this will go to this process, this will go to this process if oxygen is present, this will go to this process if oxygen is not, and then if oxygen is not present, there's 2 kinds of fermentation depending on whether you are a human or like a fungus or bacteria or something. But at any rate, oxidative respiration, when oxygen is present, oxidative respiration, aka cellular respiration, happens in 2 parts. The first of them being the Krebs cycle, which breaks down pyruvate to acetyl-CoA, but the big point is it gets these things out of the broken down sugar, happening in the matrix of the mitochondria. So the Krebs cycle produces these electron carriers in the matrix of the mitochondria. That's the important part you want to know. So here's another way of looking at it. It produces some ATP, a little bit. It produces these electron carriers. These are what we really care about, because these power the next step of the cycle. This is also because doing this involves breaking the sugar down. This is where the CO2 is produced. In the Krebs cycle, it makes the CO2. So that's the overview of the cycle. This is what goes on up here to prepare it for the cycle. So glucose became pyruvate, got broken into pyruvates. Each pyruvate becomes this acetyl-CoA, and then that acetyl-CoA goes into the cycle, producing this energy carrier and these electron carrier molecules, and also this. Now, why did I say these are so important? It's because of what comes next. ETC stands for the electron transport chain. The electron transport chain will come after this. Okay, yeah. CO2 is produced. All right, that's what I'm wanting. Electron transport chain. Those molecules produced in the Krebs cycle are super important. The electron transport chain powers the production of ATP. Remember, the whole point of breaking down glucose is to get ATP, because ATP is the energy source that runs the cell. So these things produced by the Krebs cycle power the production of lots and lots of ATP through the electron transport chain. Pay attention to the location. Inner membrane of the mitochondria is where the electron transport chain takes place. Essentially what it does is it uses these electron carrier molecules I was pointing toward earlier to pump hydrogen ions to one side of the cell membrane, and then they all flow back through like a waterfall, powering an enzyme that produces ATP. So the whole point of this is to use electron carriers to build up hydrogen atoms to gush through like a waterfall so that it can power an enzyme that makes ATP. So NADH and FADH2 carry electrons to the electron transport chain. The electrons pump hydrogen ions across the membrane. They build up on this side. Then they come through like a waterfall, turning this thing to produce ATP. This is called ATP synthase. It's the enzyme that does it's the enzyme that does it, and then it produces the ATP, the energy. That's how it gets energy from it's a very indirect process, but that's how it gets energy out of glucose. Oxygen is required because these electron carriers mentioned earlier, where did it go? NADH and FADH2, they release electrons, but those electrons go through the system and have to go somewhere. And so what they do is they get carried away by oxygen, which combines those electrons with some hydrogen ions floating around to make water. That's why you breathe out water. The O in water came from the oxygen that you breathe. So that's essentially what this is all going on here. All right, electron transport chain overview. Yes, the electrons go through here, get picked up by oxygen, carried away as water, and as they go through, they pump up hydrogen ions. Hydrogens go pouring through here to cause this to produce ATP, and that's what your body wants, is the ATP. Okay, what if no oxygen is present? You do fermentation, so do other organisms, but your kind is the lactic acid kind. Humans do this, and animals in general. So fermentation, if there's no oxygen present, you cannot do the electron transport chain because you don't have oxygen to collect those electrons at the end. So this whole thing shuts down when there's no oxygen. Instead, you do this process that allows you to recycle this that was produced by the Krebs cycle. More importantly, you don't get much ATP out of it, but it allows the machinery of your systems, especially your Krebs cycle, to keep going. All right, that's a quick overview of cellular respiration and fermentation.